Diane Hartwell had spent 2 years trying to fill the silence Robert left when he died. The 100-acre farm in Vermont, with its apple trees lined up like soldiers in formation, had become her refuge and, at the same time, her border. Every morning she followed the same ritual: turn on the old coffee maker, check the fences, feed the dog, and record the previous day's expenses in her notebook. It was a precise, almost military routine, but behind every movement was an invisible effort. The struggle not to fall apart. The house, once warm and full of life, now seemed too big for one person. At night, shadows moved across the walls as if the past still breathed in every corner. Her son, Albert, called her every night at the same time, always with the same question: "Are you alone, Mom?" He said it in a gentle voice, but there was something in that tone that made her grip the phone tightly. Care or control? She no longer knew which it was. That October night, as the wind blew down from the mountains and the smell of damp wood filled the kitchen, Diane noticed something out of place. On the table, perfectly centered between the plate and the salt shaker, lay a white envelope. She didn't remember leaving it there. It had no stamp or name, only its presence, as simple as it was unsettling. She opened it carefully, as if afraid the paper might burst. Inside, she found a faded photograph. The house seen from the gravel driveway, the red barn in the background, and 4 people looking toward the camera. She recognized Robert, young and confident, with an arm around her waist. Herself, smiling, holding a baby wrapped in a yellow blanket. And a married couple she didn't know. The man had a commanding expression, the woman a tense, distant face. On the back of the photo, in black marker, someone had written, "The Partnership, 1992. Some debts never expire." Diane froze. That was the same year they had bought the farm, the year Robert showed up with cash, saying a distant uncle had died. But that uncle had never existed. For long minutes, Diane stood by the table, staring at the photograph and the yellowish light from the ceiling. She felt the air grow heavier, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Inside, something familiar yet forgotten stirred, a mixture of fear and mistrust. She looked again at the faces of the unfamiliar couple, trying to recognize some detail. The man wore an expensive watch, the kind Robert could never have afforded in 1992. The woman, a pearl necklace with a leaf-shaped clasp. Diane wondered if this was a warning or a memory, and why the envelope had appeared that particular night. She opened the window for some air, but the cold wind brought her only the echo of the apple trees rustling in unison, as if someone were walking among them. When the phone rang, she almost dropped the photograph. She answered, her voice trembling, hoping to hear Albert, but an unfamiliar male voice answered. He introduced himself as James Thornton, a lawyer from Boston. He said he had been trying to reach her for months, but his calls had never been returned. Diane felt a chill. Thornton mentioned a name that was both foreign and painfully familiar: William and Catherine Morse. He claimed that the couple had died 6 months earlier and had named her prominently in their will. According to him, the Morses had met her and Robert back in 1992, when the farm was acquired. That word rang like a bell in her head. Acquired. He didn't say bought. Diane, her voice low, promised to meet with him the next day, without mentioning her son. When he hung up, she stared at the phone as if it were a dangerous object. For hours, Diane couldn't get that phone call out of her mind. She wondered why a Boston lawyer had her number, how he'd gotten her address, and above all, why Albert had never mentioned that couple to her. Deep down, she knew the answer was in the photograph. It wasn't just a coincidence. The Morses were connected to the farm, and that connection had been buried for 30 years. Anxiety mingled with a strange clarity, as if every piece of the past were falling back into place. She remembered the day Robert arrived with the cash, a gray bag full of bills that smelled of fresh ink. She'd asked where it came from, and he'd simply said, "Family, don't ask any more questions." That sentence had become a stone in her memory, one that was now beginning to shift. That night she barely slept. She got up several times to check the locks, turning on her flashlight to walk down the hallway and make sure everything was as it should be. At midnight, She found an old box in the closet in Robert's office. Inside were folders, invoices, and a brown envelope with her name on it. When she opened it, a small key fell onto the desk. It was engraved with a number, 247. Underneath it, a note written in her husband's firm hand read, "Open only if something happens to me. Don't tell Albert." Diane stared at the note, her throat dry. It was a warning, but also an instruction. In that instant, she understood that the son she had protected so fiercely mustn't know. She put the key in her apron pocket, dimmed the lights, and sat down by the telephone, waiting for the usual call. When Albert asked, in his usual tone, if she was alone, she lied for the first time. She said that a representative was there inspecting the property. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Albert didn't answer in his usual gentle voice, but in a dry, almost annoyed tone. "I'll stop by early tomorrow to talk about the future," he said before hanging up. Diane sat there, staring at the dead phone as if she could still hear his breathing on the other end. She knew this visit wasn't a sign of affection. It was a warning. She put the key in her pocket and tried to think rationally. If Albert had intercepted calls, it meant he could also monitor the mail or even the bank accounts. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel guilty for distrusting her own son. She felt fear, yes, but also a new, almost unknown strength, the need to protect herself. At 5 in the morning, the headlights of an SUV illuminated the hallway window. Albert had arrived earlier than promised. Diane watched from the stairs as he entered without knocking, using the key she kept only for emergencies. He wore a dark coat and an expression that mixed weariness and distrust. He said they needed to talk, that there was unfinished business. Diane feigned composure, poured coffee and listened. He spoke of selling part of the property, of how she needed to rest, of how complicated it was to maintain the estate alone. Diane merely nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating how to leave without arousing suspicion. When he finally left, she leaned against the sink and let out a sigh she had held back for years. She knew she couldn't stay much longer. As soon as Albert left, Diane closed the blinds and found the old leather bag she used to take to the village. She put the key, the envelope with the photograph, and some cash inside. She started the car shortly before dawn, when the mist still covered the dirt roads and no one was out. She drove to Burlington without looking at her phone, following the road as if she were running from a memory. When she arrived, she parked 2 blocks from the bank and waited for the sun to rise enough for them to open. On the passenger seat, she had the lawyer Thornton's number written on a piece of paper. She called him from a public phone booth, avoiding using her own cell phone. He answered immediately, surprised to hear her. They arranged to meet at an unassuming coffee shop near the First National Bank. Thornton was a gray-haired man with a reserved demeanor, the kind of person who chose his words carefully. He listened without interrupting as Diane told him about the envelope, the photo, and the key. When she showed him the engraved number, he nodded gravely. Box 247 existed, registered to Robert Hartwell. He accompanied her to the bank and arranged access. The manager, Evans, requested additional verification and disappeared for several minutes before returning with a small metal box. Diane opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 3 things: a USB drive, a leather notebook, and a folded letter. As soon as she saw Robert's handwriting, she knew that what she had feared all night was about to be confirmed. The first lines of the letter were enough to make her hands tremble. Robert wrote with the serenity of someone confessing too late, knowing he can no longer undo what he's done. "If you're reading this, it's because I couldn't stop what I sowed," he said. He recounted how, in 1992, he had discovered that his boss, William Morse, was laundering money for a man named James Carver, a businessman with criminal ties. Instead of reporting him, Robert accepted a deal, his silence in exchange for the farm Diane so desperately wanted. "I thought I was buying you a future," he continued, "but I only bought a debt that will never expire." Diane read those words several times, feeling a part of her story crumble. Not only had her husband lied, her entire life had been built on that lie. The notebook completed what the letter hinted at. In the final pages, Robert recounted his fear that Carver would one day discover the agreement and make him pay. He had saved evidence, names, dates, accounts on the flash drive, but didn't dare hand it over to the authorities. Diane closed the notebook with a long sigh, trying to process the magnitude of what she had just discovered. Thornton watched her silently, without pressuring her. When she looked up, he simply said, "We need to protect this." In that instant, Diane understood that her safety and the truth were intertwined. They left the bank unnoticed, and before parting ways, the lawyer gave her a digital copy of the documents and his personal number. "Don't tell your son anything yet," he warned. She nodded. There was no need to explain. The return trip was a long conversation with herself. Diane didn't turn on the radio. She preferred to listen to the engine and the rhythmic tapping of branches against the windshield. She thought about Robert, the man he had been, his increasingly frequent silences during the last years of his life. She also thought about Albert, his insistence on knowing if she was alone, his protective tone that she now understood as surveillance. There were signs she had previously ignored: the monitoring of her bank accounts, the surprise visits, the way he reviewed her papers to help. All of it now fit into a pattern. What hurt her most was the certainty that her son didn't see her as a mother, but as an obstacle or, worse, a tool. When he arrived at the farmhouse, the sky was beginning to darken and a low mist covered the fields. As he entered, he immediately noticed something was different. A window was open and the shed door was ajar. The air smelled of tobacco, and Albert didn't smoke. He walked slowly to Robert's desk and discovered that the folders were out of place. There was no doubt someone had been looking for something. He locked the front door, turned off the lights, and sat in absolute silence, trying to collect his thoughts. He had to act fast. He took out his phone and dialed Thornton's number, but the call dropped before the first ring. He tried again, and the same metallic noise gave him the answer: interference. He put his phone away and took a deep breath. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had a plan. Dawn found her still in the armchair, eyes wide open and body stiff. The clock read 6:30 when she decided to move. She couldn't just wait around. She filled a thermos with coffee, grabbed the wool coat Robert usually wore in winter, and stuffed the flash drive and notebook into a canvas bag. Her plan was simple: take the material to a safe place, far from the farm. As she walked toward the truck, the sound of an engine made her stop. A black SUV was driving along the gravel road. She didn't have to look twice to know who it was. Albert was back. Diane gritted her teeth, put the bag on the passenger seat, and pretended everything was normal. Albert stepped out of the car quickly, almost nervously. He carried a black briefcase and wore an expression that mixed worry and urgency. He said they had talked enough on the phone, that it was time to make some decisions. Diane listened, without interrupting. He spoke of selling part of the land, of putting his name on the deeds, of securing the future before someone else did. She simply said she would think about it. She didn't want to confront him yet. She needed time. When he left, the farmhouse fell silent again, but it wasn't the same. It was a silence that smelled of danger. Diane looked at her watch and knew she had to leave before noon. Diane drove for hours without looking back, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. Every curve of the mountain road was a reminder that she couldn't trust anyone anymore. When she reached Burlington, she parked near the police station and walked to a coffee shop to think. She couldn't turn everything in without first understanding what the evidence implied. She turned on her old laptop and plugged in the flash drive. Inside, she found folders labeled with dates and names. One of them, Morse 1992, contained scans of checks, contracts, and a list of transfers to shell companies. Diane realized this wasn't just a shady deal. It was large-scale money laundering. The farm had been Robert's reward for keeping quiet. She packed everything up again and called Thornton from a public number. The lawyer arrived in less than half an hour, looking tense. He explained that Carver was now a businessman with political connections and that any move had to be made discreetly. He suggested handing the information over to a trusted federal agent, but Diane knew that involved risks. If Albert was working for Carver, he already suspected her. They decided on a simple strategy. keep the evidence hidden until they obtained official protection. While they were having coffee, Thornton asked her not to go back alone that night, but she knew she had to go back. "If I run away, he wins," she said, getting up with a calmness she didn't even understand. The drive back felt longer than ever. The rain had begun to pour, and the headlights barely illuminated the mud pooling on the curves. Diane drove slowly, mentally rehearsing every detail of the plan. She would hide the evidence somewhere safe on the farm, far from where Albert or anyone else could find it. When she arrived, the sky was pitch black, and only the sound of rain hitting the roof accompanied her footsteps. She opened the front door and knew immediately she wasn't alone. There was a scent of men's cologne, one that wasn't her son's. She stood still for a few seconds, letting her heart calm, and then walked into the living room with her flashlight on. On the table lay a used mug and a cigarette butt. The landline phone dangled from its cord, and one of the family photos was missing from its frame. Diane swallowed hard and carefully climbed the stairs, checking room by room. Everything seemed in order, but the feeling of intrusion was undeniable. In her bedroom, the drawer where she kept personal documents was open. There was no doubt someone had been searching for the same evidence she had found. She closed the curtains, turned off the lights, and sat on the bed with her flashlight off. Outside, lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the barn, and with each flash, Diane could have sworn she saw a silhouette moving among the apple trees. The rain didn't let up all night. Diane stayed awake, sitting on the floor beside the bed, holding an unlit flashlight and listening to every sound the house made. She didn't know if the man among the apple trees was Carver, someone he'd sent, or just her imagination, but she couldn't afford to find out. At dawn, the storm had subsided, and the air smelled of damp earth. She went out onto the porch, her coat soaked, and surveyed the landscape. Everything looked the same, yet nothing was. She decided that hiding was no longer enough. She had to act. She went back inside, packed the evidence into a metal box, and buried it beneath the old barn bench where Robert used to keep his tools. Mid-morning, she received a call from Thornton. The lawyer confirmed that James Carver's name appeared in federal investigations, but that so far no one had obtained direct evidence. "What you have could change everything," he said, his voice tense. Diane hung up without saying much. She knew that every word could be overheard. She spent the rest of the day sealing windows, checking locks, and noting her movements in a notebook. As the sun began to set, she lit the fireplace and made herself some simple soup. While she was eating, she heard an engine approaching. Her heart stopped for a moment. She looked out the window and saw the headlights of a white vehicle pull up in front of the barn. Diane turned off the lights without thinking. From the window, she caught a glimpse of a man's silhouette getting out of the car with purposeful strides. It wasn't Albert. He was taller, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a hat that barely revealed his face. He walked to the porch with the ease of someone who knows no one can stop him. Diane felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't need to see him up close to know it was James Carver. The air seemed to freeze. She reached for her phone, but there was no signal. Everything was silent, except for the patter of water running down the gutters. Outside, Carver moved slowly, observing the house as if measuring each step before entering. Diane stepped back, her flashlight off, and hid behind the hallway door. She heard the lock click and the wood creak. The man was inside. His breathing was heavy and rhythmic. Diane held her breath, trying not to make a sound. In the reflection of the glass cabinet, she saw him move toward the dining room table, rummage through the drawers, open folders, searching for something with the desperation of someone who fears time is running out. When she heard another engine approaching, she knew it was Albert. Carver spun sharply toward the door, and for a second, Diane thought he had seen her, but the sound of the new vehicle diverted her attention. Two shadows crossed in front of the window, and then the screaming began. If you've made it this far, leave a comment telling me where you're watching this story from. Sometimes sharing is also a way to cope with fear. Albert got out of the truck, his hands raised, soaked from the rain. Diane watched him through the crack in the door, noticing the trembling in his shoulders. Carver was pointing a gun at him, demanding he hand over what his mother was hiding. The boy tried to explain, to say he knew nothing, but the other men wouldn't listen. Diane felt like every second could be her last. Without thinking, she ran toward the barn. The ground was slippery, and each step was a mixture of fear and determination. She opened the side door, grabbed the metal box where she had hidden the evidence, and held it to her chest. Her breath was ragged and gasping. Outside, the echo of the argument grew louder. She turned on the phone and dialed Lieutenant Harris's number. "They're here," she said quietly. "At the farm. Send someone." She didn't get a chance to explain more. A gunshot broke the silence, followed by a scream. Diane covered her ears and fell to the floor. The sound of metal hitting the ground echoed like a bell. When she looked up, she saw Albert running toward the barn, his shirt bloodied and his eyes wild. "Mom, hide!" he yelled before collapsing by the door. Diane dragged him inside with all her might. Trembling, not knowing if he was hurt or just dazed. In the distance, sirens began to approach, mingling with the howling wind and the rain that was starting to pour again. As the sirens grew louder, Carver tried to escape through the apple trees. Diane, still kneeling beside her son's body, saw the red and blue lights reflecting in the puddles. County officers stormed the property, guns drawn. Harris was the first to enter the barn. His tense face relaxed when he saw Diane alive. He ordered that Albert be checked on. Luckily, he only had a superficial wound on his shoulder. Meanwhile, a group of officers spread out among the trees and within minutes captured Carver. The man offered no resistance. He simply raised his hands with a bitter smile. Diane looked at him without saying a word. There was nothing more to add. The past, finally, had come to light. That morning, the farmhouse was filled with uniforms, flashlights, and voices. Thornton arrived shortly after, soaked, with a relieved expression. "She's safe," he told her, though she knew that what she had lost couldn't be recovered so easily. While the officers took statements, Diane recounted everything with surprising calm. She spoke of the envelope, the photo, Robert's letter, the 1992 agreement. Each word carried weight, but it didn't hurt the same anymore. When the lieutenant thanked her for her cooperation, she simply nodded. Dawn was near, and the smell of damp earth seemed to cleanse more than just the air. It also cleansed her story. Diane gazed at the horizon, her face tired but resolute, knowing that the worst was over. The next morning, the house seemed different. The curtains were still damp, the floor stained with mud, but the silence no longer weighed as heavily. Diane made coffee and drank it by the window, watching the police cars drive away. Albert was still asleep on the sofa, his arm bandaged. He had spent the entire night repeating that he didn't know who Carver really was, that he was only following orders to protect her. Diane didn't disturb him. She had decided to let time tell what she couldn't yet understand. She turned on the radio and, for the first time in years, let the music fill the house. It wasn't joy she felt, but a strange calm, the kind that comes when fear finally dissolves. Thornton called to confirm that the evidence and Robert's journal were in the hands of the feds. He told her that Carver's name was already leading the morning news. "You've closed a circle that's been open for 3 decades, the lawyer remarked. Diane silently thanked him and hung up. Then she paced the kitchen, touching the objects that were part of her daily life, the kettle, the tablecloths, the photographs. Everything was still in its place, but she wasn't the same anymore. She was aware that she hadn't won by force, but by patience and cunning. Her mind replayed every decision from the night before, and she understood that her victory hadn't just been surviving, but regaining control of her own story. Over the next few days, the farm emptied of strangers. The officers removed the yellow tape, the journalists stopped circling, and Diane resumed her walks among the apple trees, following her usual routine, but with a different perspective. Every tree, every tool, every familiar sound now held a different meaning. Where she once saw only work, she now saw freedom. She knew it wouldn't be easy to live with everything she had discovered, but she preferred this painful truth to continuing to live a lie. The whole town was talking about what had happened. Some called her brave, others simply lowered their voices as she passed by. She wasn't seeking recognition. All she wanted was peace. Albert was transferred to a psychiatric center in Montpelier. Before leaving, he left her a letter asking for forgiveness, written with the clumsiness of someone trying to assign blame. Diane kept it without reading it completely. She wasn't ready to forgive, but neither was she ready to hate him. She knew that, in part, he too had been manipulated. That realization helped her sleep for the first time in a long time. Every night she calmly closed the doors, lit the fireplace, and thought about Robert. She remembered him not as the man with the secret, but as the companion of the good years, the one who planted flowers in spring. Memory, she understood, doesn't erase the pain, but it accommodates it. Several weeks passed before Diane felt completely safe again. The farmhouse, once a scene of fear and secrets, became her refuge. She changed the locks, installed new lights in the barn, and hired a young woman from the village to help with the harvest. Gradually, the place filled with everyday sounds once more: the buzzing of bees, the creaking of wood, the whisper of the wind through the branches. Every day she rose early, drank coffee on the porch, and watched the apple trees blossom, reminding herself that she was still there, that she had survived. Sometimes the silence still brought echoes of the night of the shooting, but she learned to let them go, like dry leaves in autumn. One morning, she received a letter from the FBI. It informed her that James Carver was facing multiple charges and that her testimony had been key to initiating the legal proceedings. Diane read it without emotion. What comforted her most wasn't official justice, but knowing that no one else would knock on her door in the middle of the night. She put the letter in a box along with the old photo and the key to 147. Then, she turned on her computer and opened the forum where so many people shared experiences of loss and resilience. She began to write her story calmly, without embellishment, like someone who could finally speak without fear.